I think most people know, and it was urban legend for a long time until it was confirmed by several sources in the past few years. Ric Flair was in discussion several times to go to the WWF. He decided not to go, got cold feet, whatever you want to say, several times, before finally negotiating with Vince McMahon seriously in 1988. And basically, he was going to leave Jim Crockett Promotions, for the WWF. He was set to debut at Brother Love's show at SummerSlam 88, which was much hyped to include a surprise guest or a surprise announcement. This was confirmed by Bruce Pritchard and Conrad Thompson on Something to Wrestle episode 117, which is all about SummerSlam 1988. But he would jump to the WWF at that time. This was the plan, as a new top heel to work toward a potential feud with Hogan. What really happened, for those of you who don't know, I'm just going to run this down. He didn't come. He stayed in Jim Crockett Promotions. On the WWF side, Hogan and Savage, as the Mega Powers, defeated Andre and DiBiase at SummerSlam. Started sowing the seeds of jealousy between Hogan and Savage. Jim Duggan's return instead was replaced, Jim Duggan's return replaced Ric Flair's debut instead on the Brother Love show. The Mega Powers continued to feud with DiBiase, Andre, the Twin Towers, well into 1989, leading to the big Mega Powers explode at WrestleMania 5, Hogan and Savage. Hogan feuded with the Boss Man, with Savage, with Zeus, leading into Hogan and Beefcake versus Zeus and Savage at SummerSlam 89, and then they fought in the big, No Holds Barred, the movie, the match, the movie, in December of that year, in a big cage match, which was promoted by one of the most insane promos of all time. Go, just YouTube, if you've never seen it. Zeus, Macho Man, Sherry, Cage, No Holds Barred promo. And it's maybe one of the greatest things I've ever seen in wrestling. So that was the WWF side in Ric Flair's absence. Now, Jim Crockett Promotions was a bit different. Ric Flair had been feuding with Lex Luger, who, they had kicked out of the Horsemen earlier that year. He had matches at Great American Bash in May against Luger, escaping with the title. They kept having matches throughout the year, building to a big showdown at Starrcade with Lex Luger not being able to beat Ric Flair in 1988. He took on challengers like Rick Steiner, Lex Luger, Sting in the end of the year. But Jim Crockett Promotions sold to Turner Broadcasting in November of 1988. That's just kind of the short history of WCW, since we're talking more about WWF. So then in 89, with WCW owning Jim Crockett Promotions, we got the Flair Steamboat Trilogy in 89, Chi-Town Rumble in February, Clash of the Champions, Raging Cajun in April, Music City Showdown in May, which that fed directly into the infamous Terry Funk feud. Fantastic matches, Terry Funk versus Steamboat, Terry Funk versus Flair. Everyone talks about the I Quit match, but their one-on-one match at the Bash, I believe it is, was a bit better. And then they had a fun, what was it called? Not Chamber of Horrors. The electrified Thunderdome cage at Halloween Havoc of that year with the Great Muta and Terry Funk versus Sting and Flair. So that's the WCW side of things. Now, what's interesting to note is Flair did not end up leaving. He stayed with WCW, and part of the reason he decided to stay with WCW was out of loyalty to his friends and to the company, to the Crockett's. Arn and Tully were still there. He had the Horseman thing going still. But I noted that just think about these people who arrived in WWF in 1988. So Curt Hennig debuts in mid-98, becomes Mr. Perfect in October of that year. Arn and Tully jump, even though he stayed kind of out of loyalty to them, in October of 1988 and stayed in the WWF for a year. Barry Windham jumped in June of 1989 and came over as the Widowmaker. I want to do a fantasy scenario with the Widowmaker sometime, because He didn't change a whole lot gimmick-wise. He was kind of an evil or a mean-spirited cowboy, a heel cowboy. But how can you go wrong with a name like Widowmaker? I mean, for Christ's sakes, that is just think of that promo, the simplest promo. You got two guys facing each other. The one guy's like, I'm going to go out to the ring, I'm going to kick your ass and take your title. And Wyndham could just stand there and say, yeah, well, I'm going to make your wife a widow. I mean, fuck, that's it. That's all you need. Widowmaker, what a fucking awesome name. I think one of the most, maybe most disappointing runs, because Wyndham never really had that shot, the top shot in WWF, and the name is fucking awesome. And then Dusty, the booker, ended up jumping in mid-1990 and stayed until, mid-1989, and stayed until January of 1991. Now, I looked at a few things, and first of all, things that jumped out at me. One of the big issues with Rick coming over, and I know everyone says, oh, bring him over and do the Horsemen because Arn and Tully were coming and stuff like that. You know, bring Rick over, make him a top guy. What do you do with Ric Flair in 1988 in the WWF? In the WWF, it was all about larger-than-life personalities. Hulk Hogan was, beach muscle American hero. Hacksaw Jim Duggan was kind of a tough American brawler. Carried the flag, kind of played that gimmick up. The Ultimate Warrior was essentially a comic book character come to life. It was underplayed, but he was a Native American warrior powered by the spirits of those who had fallen before him. The Macho Man was, I guess, if you're going to sum it up in 2018, 2019, toxic masculinity. Macho Man. That's, I think, a perfect way to go about it. Brutus the Barber Beefcake, strutting and cutting. The $1 Million Man. And I think guys like the $1 Million Man really posed an issue to Ric Flair in how he would be presented in 1988. Because two people actually in particular, DiBiase and Rick Rude. Flair's gimmick was the kiss-stealing, wheeling-dealing, limousine-riding, jet-flying, Rolex-wearing son of a gun. Rick Rude was the ladies' man. $1 Million Man was the rich elitist. So what do you do with that kiss-stealing, limousine-riding Ric Flair when you have the consummate ladies' man and the $1 Million Man? That's one of the biggest issues when I started just kind of thinking about this and what would have happened. And if we know anything from the WWF and how they treated guys coming over that had kind of a traditional wrestling character, and there were no frills. Not that Ric Flair was no frills, but with those guys filling those roles, Mr. Perfect was Mr. Perfect. What do you do with Ric Flair? You just come in and you just put him over people and have him wrestle good matches and heel his way out? I mean, it seems kind of basic for that crowd, for what they had been kind of geared towards. So that was the first issue that kind of came up. The other thing is, who would Flair really have beaten, and what would he have done to get to Hogan? On episode 117 of Something to Wrestle, Pritchard mentions that the one of the plans was for Rick to go almost a whole year to build him, to let him get over with the fans, then go and face Hogan or whoever was on top. So, again, how do you do that? You got a 1-year build, let's say, and does that mean SummerSlam 89 versus Hogan? That'd be difficult to do, because SummerSlam 89 was Hogan and Beefcake versus Savage and Zeus. And that was a huge moneymaker for them because of the tie-in to the movie, and they did a pay-per-view double shot, as I mentioned, in December. No holds barred. The match, the movie, the match. Only on pay-per-view. I know I don't do a great McMahon. But that poses a serious challenge, too. So then you start to think about, does he challenge Savage? Because in 88, when he was talking about coming in, Savage was the WWF champion. And he was going to be champion as they built the feud to Hogan. And as Pritchard, as I mentioned, had confirmed on his podcast, The plan, even if Ric Flair came in, was still to roll with Hogan and Savage doing the big matchup at WrestleMania 5. So where does it leave Flair? Does he challenge Savage on the house shows in 88? Do you get him over that way by having him be a contender to Savage and losing by DQ or count out or shenanigans? They'd be great matches. But, and the going rumor for a long time was that he was going to be brought in to face Savage at SummerSlam instead of doing the Mega Powers Mega Bucks. But that wouldn't make sense either because he was set to debut on Brother Love Show and be introduced to the world on SummerSlam. I still do think a Savage house show run in 88 would have been nice, but again, why go there? Maybe if they know they're both going to be heels in 6 months, let's do this and try to get Flair over. Because if you look at the house shows, and again, another big issue before we kind of get into where everything's at and what things might have looked like, we think of things today modern-wise in the way WWE tells their stories today, 2018, 2019. Nowadays, it's building toward pay-per-views, building toward network specials, building toward WrestleMania. Back then, they were about running big angles on TV or having a big match on a pay-per-view that would then lead to house show business for 6 or 8 months after that, or even a year in some cases. It's like if you look at the Mega Powers exploding, Hogan and Savage, like if we think of that in terms of today's feuds, the angle and build-up would have been Savage, like the angle would have been Savage and Hogan leading to that point, and then the blow-off at WrestleMania. But if you look at how it really worked out, that match at WrestleMania was the first encounter. They feuded for well over a year after that. In fact, they had a match right before WrestleMania 6 on Saturday night's main event with Buster Douglas as the special guest referee. So a year out from WrestleMania, they were still hot. And looking at the lay of the land here, house shows and matchups, the feuds in the WWF in August and September were, Jake Roberts and Rick Rude were doing their thing. Andre was feuding with Duggan. He was challenging Savage for the title, a series of DQ finishes on the fall house shows. You had, One Man Gang versus Junkyard Dog, Beefcake versus Hercules, Dino Bravo versus Patera. So you got some people being built, some newer heels. Hogan and DiBiase carried their feud on into the fall. They were building Haku with matches against Tito Santana. Duggan faced DiBiase. And then you get into October, you had Ultimate Warrior still feuding with the Honky Tonk Man into 1989. Savage and Haku, Savage had a lot of title defenses. They heated Haku up with the King Haku gimmick, and he was challenging some of the top baby faces there. DiBiase versus Hercules, because they had the big, Hercules as his slave type thing, that angle, if you're not familiar. Hercules was a Bobby Heenan guy. Heenan traded him to DiBiase, and Hercules did his big I'm no slave thing. Mind you, Virgil is still carrying DiBiase's bags, but let's not go there. Savage feuded with Bad News in November. Akeem continued feuding with Andre. Then Jake started feuding with Andre. And then Savage started feuding with Ravishing Rick Rude a little bit toward the end of the year. So that was kind of the lay of the land. Those are all the big angles that had you already had some big matches before that, and they would continue on. I think Bad News fought Savage on NBC earlier in that year, in the summer, I think it was, because Savage had a big match against Andre, and then maybe in the fall had the match with Bad News. So again, it was around those dates, but those TV Saturday Night Main Event and pay-per-view dates a lot of times were springboards for the house show business because it was so big. So that's another thing, too, is it's hard to think of what they would do with Flair coming from a modern perspective. Because we think, come in, shoot the angle, work the big couple matches on pay-per-view, maybe a Saturday night's main event and build to WrestleMania. But unfortunately, that wasn't how they did it back then. So, and the other thing, too, is I was talking about Savage. If you're trying to get Flair over and you're going to feud if you're going to do Hogan and Savage at WrestleMania, does Flair take the title off of Savage at some point and does Savage get it back? WWF is a babyface territory. The only way that I could see that working or happening is if Savage came in immediately. Flair came in immediately, went after Savage, won the title in late '88 or at the Royal Rumble in '89. Maybe Savage blames Hogan, leading to a non-title match at WrestleMania. But then what does Flair do with the title? Hogan never gets to beat Savage back for the title. So it only makes sense to continue a feud with Ric Flair that wasn't for the title into 1989, and then maybe Flair starts fucking with Savage or Hogan, or starts fucking with Hogan into SummerSlam territory. But again, even that wouldn't make sense because of Zeus. So I'm gonna throw something out here in just a minute that would make a little bit more sense there. The last thing that I wanted to consider before we kind of really dive in and look at what this might have looked like. What happens to Sting in this transaction? Because one of the big underlying issues that a lot of people don't talk about with this supposed what if scenario is if Flair would have went to the WWF, Ted Turner wouldn't have bought Jim Crockett Promotions. There was, I think in Ric Flair's book, he had said that no one, including Dusty, told Flair that they weren't interested without Flair. And it was Ric Flair's continued involvement with the NWA or Jim Crockett Promotions that sealed the deal. And had Flair gone, they really wouldn't have had anything to run. They didn't have any other really top heels at the time. I mean, they had some people, but no one the caliber of Ric Flair on the heel side. So I suppose they could have moved up Barry Windham, but he was a couple years removed from his top run in the NWA anyway. So, and they were still building him as U.S. champion. They could have slid him into that role, but those are big shoes to fill. So if there's no WCW, where does Sting go? What happens to him? Does he go to Japan? Does he have a run in Japan, like the Road Warriors used to? And that's another thing I want to talk about, too, down the road is, one of the other concepts I had is, what if Sting and the Ultimate Warrior switched places? What would that look like? Because that's another fascinating one, too. But, just some things to consider as we get into this. But, if you look at the lay of the land, as I mentioned, you had Hogan feuding with Zeus, Hogan feuding with Savage. If you look at some of the roster at the time, I think I just cast it aside. Here we go. Ronnie Garvin was another arrival, came in December. But you had Andre the Giant. Morocco was there for 88 for a while. Junkyard Dog left in late 88. Greg Valentine was there. Volkov, Brutus Beefcake, Davey Boy Smith, the Dynamite Kid, they left in late 88. Of course, Savage. Hercules. They heated him up and made him an upper mid-card babyface for a while. Jake Roberts. Coco Beware. I could see Flair coming in, and if you look at what they did with people like Bossman, SummerSlam, Bossman had a match with Coco. I think they had another match, or Akeem had a match with Coco on Saturday Night's Main Event around that time too. But Flair, let's look at realistically what they would have done. Obviously, we can fantasy book it all day long, and I can lay out kind of what I think would be cool. But to be honest, they would probably bring him in and put him over guys like Coco, Hillbilly Jim. Who else was there? Ken Patera was there, and Flair and Patera had a relationship. So, Patera was kind of on his way out at that point, but it wouldn't be unheard of for those guys to work together. Trying to see. Again, not too many guys. Don Morocco left in September. So he would have been gone shortly after. I think Don Morocco and Ric Flair could have had some great matches. I know a lot of people sleep on Don Morocco, but that dude was a lot better than people give him credit for. So if you look at, hey, if they know Morocco's leaving, hey, can you do the honors for Flair on a couple house shows? I could see Flair, Morocco, Hillbilly Jim, like I said. And I think Coco Beware and Ric Flair could have some great matchups. And again, even if they're just for the house, or if you're showing them on, Superstars or as a squash or preliminary on Saturday night's main event, Ric Flair selling for Coco Beware with his punches and his drop kicks and his offense would be fantastic. And Coco, people, when we think jobbers, we think of guys, that really didn't have a great rapport with the fans. Your Iron Mike Sharps is as good as he was. Barry Horowitz. But Coco Beware was fucking over. And that dude lost consistently for like 5 years before fans finally got sick of him. So I think Flair and Coco, if they had like a little, if Coco was maybe his first opponent out of the gate on the house shows, it could be fun while they're trying to build them. I also think after the Rude situation winds up, I would almost say, I would say Jake Roberts, but he had the big feud with Andre. And I think that's a huge thing with this is that I don't really see a clear-cut place for Ric Flair. A lot of things would have to be shifted around because Duggan was feuding with Bad News, unless they did Duggan versus Ric Flair at WrestleMania, which again, I don't know if that'd be a great WrestleMania match. Do you take a Ric Flair, the 60-minute man, and put him in a 5 or 6 minute match with Hacksaw Jim Duggan on WrestleMania? I don't know. And even looking at, let's go back to November. This is so difficult. And again, just making the point, there's not really a place for him. If you look at Survivor Series 88, here are the teams. You had the opening match with the Blue Blazer, Brutus Beefcake, Jim Brunzell, Sam Houston, and the Ultimate Warrior versus Honky Tonk Man, Ron Bass, Dangerous Danny Davis, Bad News Brown, and Greg Valentine. Do you take a guy that you want to position in 6 months as the next challenger to Hogan and the top wrestler in the world? Do you stick him on that team? Maybe. Maybe you go Honky Tonk, Ron Bass, Bad News, and Flair instead of Valentine? I mean, maybe. But then there's, okay, is Flair going to lose? Is Flair going to take a DQ? Is he going to take a count out? What's going to happen? Then if you want to give him a more prominent match, do you put him on Andre the Giant's team? Andre, Dino Bravo, Mr. Perfect, Rick Rude, and Harley Race. You could probably replace Dino Bravo with, although I think Dino Bravo may have been eliminated. Do you want to stick Flair, do you want to put him next to Andre and Rick Rude and Harley Race, which would be a fun team because Harley and Rick's history together. But at the same time, do you want to stick him next to Andre when you're trying to get Flair over? That might be the best place because the only other place would have been the main event. Hercules, Hillbilly Jim, Coco, Hulk Hogan, and Savage versus Hakeem, Big Moss Man, Haku, and the Red Rooster. And we know that Hogan and Savage beat everybody on the other team. There were some, count-outs. There was a double DQ for the Twin Towers, so what do? Another DQ for Flair? That's not fair to Flair, as Bobby Heenan would say. So I could almost see in Survivor Series 89, as Flair's doing the house shows with, and Hercules was a babyface then, so maybe you bring in Flair and he works with Hercules, as he's working with DiBiase, but maybe you bring Flair in and he has the DiBiase role where, Survivor Series 87, DiBiase wasn't wrestling on the card, he was doing vignettes. So maybe you do something like that and you show Ric Flair with the girls and then the limos and this is how Ric Flair celebrates Thanksgiving, which that could be fun too. And then, of course, I don't know if you'd put him in the 88 Rumble. And here's another interesting note. King Haku had beaten Harley Race for the crown of King of the WWF. So just switching things up here. Do you... Let's look at this. Let me make notes. What did I say? Hercules, Coco, Hillbilly. Promo at Survivor Series. And then maybe instead of Haku versus Harley Race at the Royal Rumble, you have Flair versus Race. Because even if the match only got 12 minutes, they could still have a great match. I don't like that idea as much as Flair. I would say put Flair in the Rumble and have him go, because who won it that year? Was it Hogan? 89. No, 89 was Big John Studd. So maybe Flair goes almost all the way. And he's one of the guys that eliminates Hogan, Hogan eliminated Savage. And then Bossman and Akeem kind of eliminated Savage. And maybe you do something with... See, that's another hard one. Maybe you shift it and you do Roberts, Flair... Maybe Flair eliminates Jake instead of Andre. And they've been building that feud for a while, though. Well, maybe they wouldn't if they knew where they were going. Maybe they go Flair versus Jake at Mania, which would be a great matchup. And that would be a really good match on the house shows and really solidify Flair. Then, feud with Jake into the house show circuit leading up to SummerSlam. Who's another top babyface in 89? Well, let's look at SummerSlam. Okay, hang on. Let me go back to WrestleMania. Hercules, Haku, Twin Towers versus the Rockers, Beefcake versus DiBiase, Bushwhackers versus Rougeaus, Perfect versus the Blazer, Demolition, Powers of Pain, Dino Bravo versus Ronnie Garvin. Maybe Flair and Garvin. Maybe Flair and Garvin have a really, really hard-hitting... just let those guys go out there and do their thing. Give it the WWE magic. But have those guys go out there and just have just amazing matches and just chop the shit out of each other. So Garvin, Flair, let's see the other matches. Tito Santana feuded with Rick Martel after the Strikeforce breakup at Mania, so maybe you even give Flair Tito. Because they did mixed matchups, but Flair and Garvin, maybe throw Tito Santana in there, some more tried and true wrestlers. Then you work in a Jim Duggan. I don't know. Maybe the Red Rooster, have Flair, the Red Rooster job into Flair, because Terry Taylor was a huge Ric Flair fan. I don't know. That doesn't look too bad. Because then if you look at... that's the roster. I don't need that. So if you look at SummerSlam 89, you have the big Hogan and Savage. I'm sorry. Yeah, Hogan and Beefcake versus Savage and Zeus. And I even think after that blow-off, you could have Beefcake, since he's one of the top baby faces, work with... and maybe that's the way to go. Maybe that's the way to go. Maybe that's the way he gets to Hogan. Maybe Flair has a match at SummerSlam with, instead of Valentine and Garvin having their feud, maybe it's Flair and Garvin. Or maybe you have Snuka versus Flair instead of DiBiase versus Snuka at SummerSlam. Do it, but something. Figure something out, right? Or Dusty versus Flair, although Dusty needed the win at that point. But, you could do a Survivor Series team with, the Heenan family. And instead of... Well, no, you can't do that because then you've got Andre and the Busters. I put that one on here. Okay, yeah, where would you put Flair? There's the Dusty, Beefcake, Rooster versus Bossman, Bad News, Martel, and Honky. Man, maybe you take the Honky Tonk Man out of there. And Flair gets disqualified for brutalizing Beefcake. Maybe Hogan puts Beefcake in the figure four and won't let go. Gets disqualified. Brutus is hurt. And I know they did an injury type angle with Bossman clubbing Dusty after the match. But I don't know. I think you could get away with this. It's a little bit different. And then have Flair feud with Beefcake. Beefcake still has the allegiance with Hogan. And that would take you to WrestleMania. And then maybe, what is it? Instead of doing Warrior and Hogan at WrestleMania 6, maybe Flair eliminates Hogan, the WWF champion, from the Rumble and wins. And maybe, let's see, because the Busters would have went back to WCW by then. But, hey, maybe he's still managed by Bobby Heenan. And Heenan's like, I've had Giants, I've had, Rick Rude, I've had this, I've had that, but this is the greatest opportunity in the world, and go to WrestleMania with Hogan and Savage, or Hogan and Flair. And throw some heat on it with Flair. Like I said, Flair injures Beefcake, and maybe he keeps, they feud into maybe on a Saturday night's main event in January. Hogan comes down to save Beefcake. And now Flair's maybe like, hey, big man, now I've got your attention. Now I've got your eye. For 10 years you ducked me. And while I beat the best in the world, I beat Harley Race, I beat Dusty Rhodes, I beat this guy, I beat that, blah, 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 blah. I beat everyone there is to beat. I've beaten everybody in the WWF there is to beat. Everyone they put in front of me, and now I'm staring at you. That kind of thing. And it'd be, very natural. And then go Flair Hogan. And Toronto, man. Toronto's a cool crowd. I think they would really dig Flair and Hogan. I don't think it would have been crapped on them like a lot of other matches were. But yeah, man, Flair and Hogan at WrestleMania 6, what a fucking fantastic match that would probably be. I think that's probably how they would do it, to be honest with you. Because if you look at the way they do things, and if you look at all of the other goings on in the WWF at the time, you can't plug him in at SummerSlam versus Hogan because you've got the Mega Powers, the Megamaniacs versus Zeus and Savage. There's that big long angle. Bossman was doing hot house shows with Hogan, steel cages and all sorts of shit, grudge matches. Then he moved into the feud with Zeus. That was big business, and then they went to Hogan and Warrior at the Skydome in Toronto. I really don't think there's another way you fit him in. So how does that sound? I mean, this is the WWF way. And again, I don't think it sounds too bad, even from a fantasy booking perspective, but Flair comes in, he goes over Coco, Hercules, Hillbilly, who, again, Hillbilly was another friend of Hogan's, so there's that. I've beaten all your friends, I've beaten all your foes, blah, blah, blah. Maybe he does a promo at Survivor Series 88, just recapping. Then maybe you do Flair versus Race at Royal Rumble 89, or maybe Flair's in the Royal Rumble and he goes like 50 minutes. The issue with that, just from a perspective standpoint, from a marketing even standpoint, I'm not speaking as a booker, just as a fan and someone thinking about value. If you put Ric Flair in the Royal Rumble, even if he goes 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and he gets eliminated at the end, I don't know if you want to put Ric Flair in too many compromising positions. Because the way they used to treat guys, the way those fans reacted to guys like him with that style, You got to do everything you can to make him look special. So to me, if you're going to put him in the Royal Rumble, he's got to go all the way. Or he's either got to last the entire Rumble and just miss it. But Ric Flair, to me, is a heel that needs to win. And needs to win big. So, sure, he's going to do his time with Coco, Hercules, and Hillbilly. Promo at Survivor Series 88 to get people ready. Flair versus Race at Royal Rumble. Flair feud with Jake. And a match at WrestleMania. Because if you think about it, Jake did kind of represent, although he represented the dark side of the human psyche, he did really represent the everyman. He had a really blue-collar feel to him. And that's what made the feud with DiBiase work. It made the feud with Rick Martel work. And it's kind of interesting if you look at the supporting baby faces for Hulk Hogan at that time, and if you look at the heels, you had Randy Savage was, I don't know if he came off as rich, but he was the Macho King when he was a heel. I had the hot chick, so he seemed like an elite type of person. He almost came off as like an MVP athlete type of guy. Then you had the model Rick Martel, who ended up feuding with Jake in 1991. Tito in 1989, 1990. That was another kind of elitist versus everyman situation. The Big Boss Man, when he turned babyface, how blue collar can you be other than a police officer? Hacksaw Jim Duggan was very blue collar. So if you look at Dusty Rhodes, if you look at WWE's top baby faces in 1989 and 1990, guys that really supported Hogan, got the heels over to face Hogan, those guys all had a very common, very humble, blue-collar type feel to them. So, I got to go back and recap. I'm ADD, guys. I'm getting tired. So, Flair, Coco, Hercules, Squashes, Hillbilly. Let's see. Promo at SummerSlam or Survivor Series 88. Flair versus Race at Royal Rumble. Flair versus Jake on house shows and at WrestleMania 5. More house show matches with Duggan. Now he's moved up to the next level. Duggan, Tito, feud with Ronnie Garvin at SummerSlam 89. Feud with Beefcake, be on the Enforcers team maybe at Survivor Series 89. Maybe. And then feud with Beefcake, house shows and Royal Rumble, or Survivor Series to the Rumble. And then Flair wins the Rumble and faces Hogan at WrestleMania. Now, an unforeseen thing from that would be if they did Flair and Hogan at WrestleMania 6 instead of the Ultimate Challenge, and they pushed the Ultimate Challenge out another year. That would have the unintended consequence of setting up a bunch of fresh opponents for the Ultimate Warrior. And I'm going to talk about this. I might do it next week. I might do it another week or two. I'm not sure. Maybe closer to WrestleMania. But because maybe closer to WrestleMania. It just would make sense. The memory of the Warrior, he passed away around WrestleMania. But either way, one of the big beefs I have with Warrior's run, and I know there's a lot of things I'll get into when I talk about Warrior's run that didn't do him any favors. But the thing that I took away as a kid was he didn't have any fresh opponents. When Warrior won the title from Hogan, he faced Haku, who had already been beaten soundly by Hogan, by Savage, by Duggan, by all these top babyfaces. He had a feud with Rick Rude, which was a retread from the feud they'd already done. He feuded with Mr. Perfect, who again had already been soundly beaten by Hogan. So to me, It's kind of a preview to the Warrior conversation, kind of looking at a revisionist, like a new version of the Warriors run, maybe try to figure out a way to make it better. But had they moved it out a year, you would have had The Undertaker. Let's try to figure out. Anyway, we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, but it would have had the unintended consequence of giving Warrior really. The WWF had a different feel, and he would have had a bunch of fresh opponents lined up to feud with, which would have probably been a lot more entertaining than what we got. So, in the fallout of had this happened, had Flair gone to the WWF, Turner Broadcasting, as I mentioned, would not have picked up Jim Crockett Promotions without Flair. There's no denying that. Unless Turner picked up another wrestling company, there's no WCW. If there's no WCW, there's no Monday Night War. We may never have seen the Great Steamboat Flair trilogy unless they brought Steamboat back to the WWF, which could be interesting too. If they, based on Steamboat Savage, if WWF would have brought Steamboat in and had him feud with Flair and had those matches there, fucking A, there's your fantasy booking. Fuck Hogan. Let Hogan go and do other shit with, continue the feud with Savage and continue the feud with Earthquake and whoever else. Bring in Flair, Steamboat, and do Steamboat Savage at SummerSlam. Fuck, that would have been amazing. We may never have seen the infamous Flair and Funk feud, which was really good. We may never have seen the Great Muta in the United States. Let's think about that. If there's no WCW, there wouldn't have been, WWE was not doing relationships with New Japan. And I'm not sure if Muta, who was a star in Japan, would have gone to the WWF and done that schedule. And I don't think WWF would have pushed Muta the way WCW did. And that might be another story for another time. If Muta would have went full time and been, one of the top guys in WCW, because at one time he was. Another thing too is there likely would not have been a War Games adoption by WWE. In recent years, because fans have kind of demanded it, because Triple H is a big fan, they've brought War Games into WWE. I don't think that would have happened because WCW would not have had, without the Monday Night War, without Nitro, there really wouldn't have been the same, importance in it. As great as the NWA was, I don't think the WWF would have respected. It would have been just like the AWA. They're not doing the Wrestle Rock Rumble at SummerSlam or at one of their B events. They're not running the new version of the Sportatorium anytime soon. So, like I said, the possibility of earlier feuds with Savage, Hogan, Warrior, Jake. The one thing I missed out on too was Piper, though. And again, another reason why it was hard to try to think about what they would have done with Flair. Piper was away from wrestling. He was doing movies. Obviously, They Live, I believe, was released in 1988. His career didn't really take off in Hollywood. And he came back to the WWF in March. I think he had one match as a replacement for somebody against DiBiase in May. And then, guys, look, I know I usually wing things, and I'm just, when I have people on, I like to just talk and have conversations, but I really fucking prepared for this one. Piper came back and was wrestling matches in the summertime with DiBiase, I believe. There's a couple of them to note, and he was doing Piper's Pits. Then he came back, he distracted Rick Rude, and from about SummerSlam to Survivor Series, he feuded with Rick Rude on house shows. Rick Rude and Randy Savage. So Rick Rude, Randy Savage, then he went to the Royal Rumble, and then he feuded with Bad News, and then after WrestleMania, he took another break. So Piper really wasn't... Piper would not have been around, and if he would have worked with Flair, it would have had to have been in the summer of '89, which could have worked with with Piper returning. But again, how would that have gone for doing business if Piper's got his big return and he's having these big matchups, like the cage matches with Flair and Savage, or with Savage and Rude? How would that have worked out? I don't know if there was a way. I don't know if they would have wanted to do that with, I don't know, but it could have been really interesting. So instead of What did I say? Where's my notes? Oh, well. It's done with now. But, yeah, instead of doing the summer matches with Garvin, maybe he has a feud with Piper. So, I don't know. And maybe they do both of them. I don't know. But this is all fantasy anyway. But it would have been fun to have matches with those guys in their primes as opposed to, 3-4 years later when things had cooled off and the business had cooled off. It would have been fun to see it in the peak of the 80s. I didn't really go into this, but if Flair was there and they have chemistry and maybe they were all under the Heenan umbrella, maybe not because Flair didn't need the talker, but it could have meant a more meaningful role for Arn and Tully. I mean, they were the tag champions, but attaching, we as we've seen, Arn Anderson is great. But attaching them to a top act like Ric Flair really did wonders for their career and would have maybe given them a little bit more of a rub. Other than that, the Road Warriors ended up coming in 1990, late 1990, summer of 1990. So you could potentially replace Flair, Flair instead of Mr. Perfect and Demolition versus LOD. It would have been interesting to see Flair entangled with the Road Warriors in WWF. And again, a lot of this I'm just thinking of because he already has chemistry with certain guys. It would have been, as I mentioned with the NXT guys, bringing new guys in, it would have been a much easier fit, a much more natural fit. But, yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, I would much rather do a feud with Piper in the summertime. Still had the match with Garvin, but feud with Piper during the summertime leading up to the Rumble. And then something with Steamboat. The follow I don't know. Oh, what did I say? Steamboat? Yeah, replace. Do matches with Garvin, but yeah, man, Steamboat and Piper versus Flair in 1989 would be really fun to think about. But I guess maybe that's my fantasy booking version. But oh well, that's me. Anyway, what do you guys think? Shadowed by more mediocre stars of the age. I have to agree, man. And thanks for responding too, by the way. That's subreddit fantasy booking if you want to join in the conversation. But thanks, JackSO3. Yeah, I tend to agree. And again, for the issues that I laid out at the very beginning of this before we started talking about what could have happened, WWF fans were taught to accept a certain thing. And when guys like Garvin, Valentine, when they were brought in, they got some good reactions, like Steamboat Savage, again, heralded as one of the greatest matches of all time. It was a decent money draw for like a B-town. As the namesake of the show would suggest, we're a fan of B-shows. But in terms of overall acceptance by the crowd, they weren't packing him in like Hogan, Andre, the big bodies. So you're right, he probably would have been overshadowed by the big personalities. Rick was a big enough personality and a good promo. Maybe that would have been enough. But the idea, it's almost like today when we look at the landscape of wrestling. There's 1,001, I'm a good wrestler who does a lot of moves and wears tights and boots with kick pads. That's my gimmick. But there's 1,000,001 guys there that do that. And there's a lot of women now that do that. It's the people with hooks and gimmicks that set themselves apart. Same thing went for them. So especially, you got Brutus Beefcake, you got Roddy Piper, Ravishing Rick, $1 Million Man, Ultimate Warrior, Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan. And then, I'm Ric Flair Wrestling Champion. Ta-da! I think it was part of the reason why he wasn't as accepted as they hoped in 1991. I think WWE did their thing where, even though they kind of downplay other promotions, they expected people to know who the hell Ric Flair was. And I'm sorry, but it was kind of a letdown as a kid. So, if you have any ideas, things you'd like to hear about, let me know. Again, bshowbrian@gmail.com. My name is Brian J. This is The B Show.